Hello and welcome. There was an awful moment a few years ago when it really looked as though the parallels with the 1930s between then and today were becoming more and more obvious. In the 1930s in Germany, for example, the Protestant churches became something that was called Reichskirche, the state church. But the state then exercised a very powerful ideological control over the churches and over what they taught, perverting Christianity out of recognition. It's become seriously alarming that something very similar is happening in our country today. Let's look at critical race theory, for example. Not everyone will be familiar with critical race theory's pyramid, but the fact that it's being taught in schools across the country has caused alarm, and not just amongst parents. The sudden increases in the intensity of highly eroticized sex education, stretching way down before the years of even puberty, has caused widespread distress to parents and alarm to observers. But on top of that has come the burden of a highly politicized racial guilt that pyramid theory teaches. But with the reports that church schools have recently bought completely into critical race theory, and are using this much criticised pyramid which establishes the model of white guilt in their classrooms, they appear to have run scared and abandoned not only of their responsibility for children, but also dropped any defence of their own values. Why does this matter so very much? The intention of the pyramid critical race theory model is to set up a narrative in history that details white oppression and sets out to establish the guilt not only of the white people who notionally oppressed black people, but much, much worse, to make the children today responsible for all the guilt that accumulates in the mind of the race ideologues. That this itself is a dreadful act of racism is not an accusation that's allowed to stick, because at the back of critical race theory is the idea of power. It's all about the redistribution of power away from white culture. And since in this brave new world racism is defined by one race abusing another, and in this view whites have only ever abused blacks, no black person can be a racist or accused of racism. Now, to any sane and unprejudiced observer, this would seem to be a kind of Alice in Wonderland partisan nonsense. But that's the foundation on which critical race theory is built. Forget that with a range of skin tones from white through olive to brown and deep black, that different civilizations are not as easy to categorize in skin tones as critical race theory insists. Forget too that science tells us that race isn't even a concept that can be scientifically tested, but is instead a cultural and political imposition by ideologues. More important than that, the ideas that underlie it run completely counter to Christian philosophy and values in a way that completely undermines and negates them. It's doubly astonishing that this sheer theory should be being imposed on children in church schools. How is it possible that bishops, church leaders and educationalists are willing to abandon their own values, their own perspectives, their own gospel, and surrender to a movement that stands for something that is the opposite, and in the view of Christianity, highly destructive, not only to the Christian faith, but also to Western civilization that's built upon it? Central to Christianity is the insistence that guilt is a personal matter. Guilt can't be inherited. In fact, one of the reasons why we fought the Nazis so passionately in the last century was because Nazi ideology made Jewish children guilty of simply being Jewish, and so deserving of being incinerated in the ovens in the death camps. How can our society have forgotten so quickly the dangerous implication of imposing racial guilt of any kind in the light of that horrific memory that is only one generation old and in particular of imposing it on our children. In the teaching of Christianity, there is certainly guilt, but guilt and responsibility. And the genius of Christian teaching is that through a relationship with Christ, all guilt of whatever kind gets removed in an absolution that is capable of transforming the human personality. Critical race theory, on the other hand, knows of no forgiveness, personal or corporate, only of endless reparations down the generations. Racism itself is a profoundly problematic concept, although it's become the number one thought crime of our generation. Not only is it difficult, actually impossible to define, so anyone can be called a racist without the slightest empirical proof or testing. And if you are called a racist, it's almost impossible to defend yourself or come back from it. But it's essentially a thought crime. That means to assess it, you have to get into somebody's head to know what's really been going on, what they really intended, what they really meant. And that can't be done. Christianity doesn't believe in thought crime. It believes in holding people to account for what they do, not for what they think. And that's one of the reasons why the democracy and the freedom of speech have found Christian cultures such fertile ground to take root in. You could go as far to say that if the philosophical implications of critical race theory take hold in our society, then they'll produce a very serious threat to both freedom of speech and even democracy itself. CRT belongs to the left, and progressive political programs that started with political correctness but have developed into full-blown cancel culture. And unless people are free to think and speak and act as a matter of personal conscience, and unless we insist on personal and not group guilt with the permanent possibility of forgiveness, we'll find ourselves being driven ever more deeply into a dystopian future of soft totalitarianism, a prospect that appears to become more real with every passing day. The clergy, Christian leaders, and Christian educationalists ought to be not to be captive to secular moral ethic that's made racism the number one social crime. It should be pointed out that racism is already taboo amongst Christians, and not because we're better than other people, but because we follow a higher commandment already that makes racism an unlikely trait amongst Christians. One of the essential planks on which Christianity is built is the commandment that follows loving God with all our hearts, minds, and soul and strength, and that is to love our neighbour as ourselves, irrespective of skin colour. Anyone taking this seriously and practising it, as Christians historically have tried to do, is not going to be able to get away with being prejudiced against their neighbour's skin colour. Any attempt to disadvantage the neighbour in Christian philosophy and practice can always be held accountable for being the failure to love our neighbour as ourselves, irrespective of their skin. Christianity has a built-in defence against racism. It doesn't mean that people won't fail to practice the faith, but it does mean they can always be held accountable for that failure, and, as a matter of Christian integrity, be invited to change, to repent. All the studies show that practicing Christianity is good for mental health. The inculcation of trust and forgiveness, the significance of believing yourself to be created and loved by God, that's why you're here, the gift of a life that has meaning, flowing from being created, loved and forgiven, the promise of the open road to heaven, and yet the mental health of our children has never been more fragile or pressurized. And the existence of this stark gap should suggest that church schools should be teaching the faith and not critical race theory as fact, since it is steeped in guilt, revenge and collectivism. We do know that forgiveness is healthier than revenge, that the experience of the indiscriminate love of God is a recipe for better mental health than being told you're guilty for the colour of your skin. There is no forgiveness for historic racism in critical race theory, and you bear the weight of guilt not only for yourself, but for all the generations of your ancestors without limit. It's time the Church made a proper assessment of the implications of teaching critical race theory in school, not only in philosophical terms, but in terms of the health and spiritual well-being of all our children, and repudiate it, rather than allowing it to be taught as fact within our education system. The great advantage that church schools have is that they can offer an education, and they're not yet compelled to function as agencies of political and racial indoctrination. We should be inviting the clergy, the teachers, and the parents who believe in Christianity to completely repudiate the indoctrination from the left, not only for the sake of the integrity of our souls, but most especially for the salvation and the health of our children.